The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
You're now about to witness the truth.
It's the Benjamin Dixon Show.
I'm very excited about the interview tonight. Tonight, I'm speaking with Dr. Monique W. Morris. She is the author of the book Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. Dr. Morris, Monique, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you so much for making the time to be here with us. Well, first, let me just tell, I know a lot of my audience, they are very informed and very involved. Many of them probably are. In fact, I learned about you from one of my audience listeners as well as one of my producers. They have both read your book. They both were blown away by the substance of the book. And my producer literally ran me down and said, you have to get her on the show because what she has to say is very important. And so I'm glad to have you and glad to have had a chance to read the book. Let me just tell my audience, for those who may not know you, let me tell them a little bit more about you. You are the co-founder of the National Black Women's Justice Institute. You regularly write for ebony.com. You have been working in areas of education, civil rights, and social justice for more than 20 years. And you're also the author of a book called Black Stats, and lives in the Bay Area with your husband and 2 daughters. You are a family woman. You are very busy, very professional. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course.
So let's jump right into the book.
Yeah.
I hate starting out with this general question, but I have to ask, what made you write this book, and from the perspective that you wrote it from?
Yeah. Officially, in all the promotional materials, the sort of standard way we approach that is that I started researching this book about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that in many ways, I started writing Pushout when I was actually having discussions with youth in juvenile correctional facilities when I finished my first book, which was a novel back in 2001. And in the course of having some of those conversations with young people who had been criminalized, it really occurred to me that we were not spending enough time really exploring the unique vulnerabilities of girls. And then as time went on, and as data and public narratives about the quote unquote school to prison pipeline started to emerge, and more of us started to look at what was happening among girls, I noticed the stat that was emerging that Black girls were actually the fastest growing population that was receiving school discipline, exclusionary discipline. And then the 2011-12 data were released by the Department of Education that showed that Black girls were the only group of girls who were disproportionately impacted by school discipline in all categories for which discipline, data were collected. That's when it occurred to me that we really have to think about not just the statistics that signal to us that there's a problem, but we need to dig a little deeper and go right to the source, talk to the girls who have been experiencing these conditions and figure out how we're going to fix this with them.
And that's what's interesting about this is that the book is dedicated to Black girls. And there's always been, and well, maybe not always, but more recently, there's a lot of emphasis placed on violence towards young Black men and how the school system targets young Black men. And whenever we speak of that school to prison pipeline, we generally speak in context of young Black men. And you bring a light and shine a spotlight on young Black girls. Tell me why that is, and where do we fall short when we speak, even if we're speaking generally. Sometimes we exclude young Black women, young Black girls. Tell me where we fall short and what gap you're filling in this book.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, Benjamin, because I think in many ways we've inadvertently done two things. One is masculinize the experiences of girls by talking about the phenomenon of school to prison in ways that really favor the ways in which this plays out in the lives of men and boys, young men and boys. And what that does is it produces really an erasure of the experiences of Black girls and young women for whom, the issue of trauma and victimization plays heavily. The acknowledgement that there are actually multiple pathways to confinement. I actually don't really use the frame of school to prison pipeline when I'm talking about girls. I talk instead about school to confinement pathways because I, number one, recognize that there are multiple pathways that lead girls to contact with the juvenile and criminal legal system, and that when we're talking about girls, we're not really necessarily only talking about prison. And we're not only necessarily talking about prison with boys either, but in the lives of girls, there are multiple ways of being confined. Girls are disproportionately placed in residential placements. They are assigned to other types of facilities that lead to surveillance in their lives or GPS monitoring of their behaviors in ways that still are a part of the criminal and juvenile legal system, but we don't capture it if our framework is so narrow. And so, I think what we're missing really is, some of the ways in which Black femininity itself has played into or misunderstandings, the ways in which Black femininity itself has been misconstrued by the public and primarily by adults in decision-making positions to render Black girls especially vulnerable to punishment, punitive responses to girls when they don't align well or their behaviors don't align well with what our expectations might be as they've been shaped and normed by society.
Let's unpack that a little bit because you've said
Yeah.
a mouthful there in terms, particularly with the misconceptions and the perceptions of Black femininity from adults. But let's drill down. I want to talk about it from the vantage point of other African Americans because as I read over your book and I read some of the book, I'll be honest. Most people won't do this. I'm going to be honest. My first gut reaction was erasure. And my first gut reaction was, well, what about the Black boys? And I feel like I had to catch myself, right? Just full disclosure. I had to catch myself because I have a young Black daughter, right? And if something happens to my son, God forbid, and then something happens to my daughter, I would clearly see the need to bring light to my daughter's circumstances. How do you address that erasure that comes from the Black community, as well as that misconception of what Black femininity is and what it should be, particularly from the Black perspective?
I so appreciate you for being honest with that.
I thought about not mentioning it, but keep it 100.
No, say it. And this is really interesting because much of the pushback that I have received on this has not come from, Black women. It hasn't come from women of other racial groups, and it hasn't come from white men, right? A lot of the pushback has been the ways in which we have been in this false, oppression Olympics with each other, the Black men and Black women, about how our pain manifests and who gets priority in this racial justice movement. And I actually wrote this because I hope that we're moving in a direction, and I think in many communities we are, toward bridge building so that we are no longer trying to compete against each other in our degrees of oppression, but rather working together to build community. Because I said for years that Black girls and Black boys are sharing surveillance. They're sharing this structure of oppression. They go to the same schools, we share homes, we share relationships, and in many ways, we are impacted by these structures, and yet our prioritization of Black male pain has facilitated the erasure of Black female pain in many ways. So I think, number one, it's important to recognize that that is, I think a conditioned response to feeling that there's only room for one level and discussion of pain in our communities. And what we've done is we try to present the pain as uniform, right? We're all impacted by this, so let's deal with those who are greatest in numbers first, and then we'll get to you. And what that has meant is let's prioritize the men and boys whose numbers are indisputably greater than other numbers, and that absolutely deserves the investment of the foundations and our community in a way that is vigorous and that can attack the structures of oppression that are impacting Black boys and young men. But I have always maintained this argument that we have to invest in our community, but not to the exclusion of Black girls and young women, because the pain that Black boys are feeling is related to the pain that Black girls are feeling. The pain that Black girls are feeling is related to the pain that boys are feeling in our communities. And if we don't engage that consciousness and begin to attack the stereotypes that keep the division intact, then we're going to continue to experience these levels of oppression together. The piece around Black feminine identity that is important for us to understand are the historical constructs that have made Black femininity, sort of difficult to consume in the public domain. It's either presented as hypersexual or conniving, loud and sassy, right? Ratchet is the most recent way in which people have come to understand what's happening and in the expressions of Black girls. And that, the responses that people, sort of present when they are confronted with Black femininity, I argue, is leading to a push-out from school that renders girls vulnerable to participation in underground economies, and that renders them vulnerable to contact with the criminal and juvenile legal system. And it also renders them vulnerable to differential treatment and enforcement of school-based policies that can facilitate their push-out. And so that, to me, is rooted in the legacy of slavery and segregated opportunity that continues to create the wedge between the men and women and boys and girls who are experiencing similar structures of oppression, or in some cases, the exact same structure of oppression. And that doesn't get us to a place where we can interrogate the intersections between patriarchy, sexism, racism, socioeconomic oppression that impacts all of us, right? And that facilitates, punishment as a response, punishment and discipline and in response.
So let's take that Black femininity and the misconceptions, and let's apply it to the actual interactions that young Black girls have in the school system. One of the more popular cases, of course, I believe is South Carolina. South Carolina, the resource officer who picked up the student and really treated her, in a manner that really should have broke the hearts of anyone. And whether you had a child or not, this should have broken your heart, but it didn't, right? And so I want to look at it from two perspectives. The first is, what do you feel goes into the minds of the school system, the teacher, the resource, all of the players? Is it a misconception of what this child is and this young woman is? Is it a repulsion at who they are and what they stand for? Or is it just a collision of really bad factors that lead to an outburst like this and an event like this? What plays into an event like this playing out inside of a classroom?
Yeah, I think there are multiple things that were at play there. And, number one, I want to recognize that was an absolutely egregious case that did sort of capture the attention of many more people than typically respond to the type of exclusion and differential treatment that Black girls are experiencing every day in schools. So I think in some ways, the anomalous nature of a police officer coming in, lifting a girl, slamming her body, throwing her across the room is what made everybody respond and say, what on earth is happening here, right? Whereas, and the fact that the children who recorded it are still experiencing a threat of exclusionary discipline, okay, because of the structures and laws that are in place in the community that present or that see the interaction, the necessary interaction and really in some ways intervention by recording this incident by the students as somehow being an affront and disruption of the schools. Okay, so affront to and disruption of the schools. So there's an important way in which we have to see just the mere fact that we all know about that case as a part of the problem in some ways, because what is more common is that girls are experiencing being turned away from school because of how they present at school. So the clothes that they are wearing, they're turned away from school if they ask too many questions in some cases.
Wow.
They are confronted and treated as if they are being disruptive to the classroom, or they are seen as somehow presenting an affront to authority when they're engaging in questioning, which is an expression of critical thinking. There are ways in which girls are fighting and having real conflict in ways that are deeply problematic in schools, but the response to them is they are inherently problematic, get them out of here, as opposed to thinking through a continuum of responses to their behaviors and really seeing beneath the surface. Wow. One of the things that I often talk about, and even with the South Carolina case, is anyone who is looking at the physical presentation of the girl in the video and looking at many other videos that I have seen and other instances that I have seen, that there are ways in which children express exposure to trauma and victimization that are often ignored when that person expressing it is a Black girl. And there has been this historical way in which adults don't see the pain of Black girls and instead read them as them having an attitude or just being problematic. And without understanding that in many ways and spaces, Black girls are navigating structures of oppression that have not been deeply interrogated by our society, let alone by our schools, which I frame as structures of dominance in this conversation, meaning they can either act to actively disrupt the status quo and the structures of oppression, or they can work to reinforce those norms in very real ways. And so when you have this increasingly punitive climate in schools where there are officers who are there to engage in surveillance activities, there are metal detectors that are policing students, there are policies and security cameras in place, and other ways in which children are told that there are adults who are coming in to implement safety, and that is how they construct safety, then we have a deep imbalance of power and a lack of investment on the part of children to really be active players in the co-construction of their own safety. So in my conversations with girls, in the both those that made it into the book and those that didn't make it into the book, girls will often talk about how they need other things besides adults with guns to make them safe. They need other things besides a dean of student behavior, to come in and make them safe. That they need to really have active, caring adults in their life who can help them work through the root causes of these conflicts, if you will, and help to see them as whole people as they are trying to navigate, again, what has become a hyper punitive learning environment for too many of our children.
Monique, you're really touching something in my psyche here. In my time as a teacher, I'm one of those people who, I think I was a pretty good teacher, right? And I have some good reviews. They said I was a good teacher. However, I just couldn't keep doing it because of the emotional toll that it required, particularly because of the underprivileged communities that I served. It takes a huge emotional toll and commitment to explore these things. And as I hear you talking, I'm thinking about the young Black girls that I interacted with as their teacher and how I had to consciously make the decision, am I going to respond viscerally, or am I going to ask myself the question of why are they feeling and acting out this way? And I can't say that I made it 100% of the time, but there's two cases in my mind that come to mind that I actually was able to help move them to a different place because I asked the simple question of why are they reacting like this? And it brings it to even now that I left the school world and went to corporate America, one of the things that they instilled in us was you never know what that person's day was like as a consultant. And so as a consultant, it isn't our job to respond to how they're behaving on that phone call. As a consultant, it is to identify with them, explore their human condition, and then bring them on board. And we put all this emphasis for this type of treatment in corporate America. And I don't know how many people are actually doing this in the classroom. In your exploration and talking with students, do you have any examples? And I know you mentioned some in your book, but how do we get people to take that extra step, particularly with Black girls, and consider their starting position and treat them first as a whole person versus responding viscerally to what we may perceive to be an attitude?
Yeah, no, I love that comparison, because there are many ways in which our treatment of young people in classrooms is inconsistent with our expectations of them upon their graduation, right? And so, one of the things that I say, is when I was teaching in grad school, we would start each day with basically what is essentially a mindfulness exercise where I would check in with each of my grad students. And I said, we shouldn't have to wait until grad school to be able to ask someone how they're doing and what do they need in order to learn, right? Like, we shouldn't have to wait that long to teach in a way that is empathic. And so, one of the things that I think is really critical for us, both as educators, but also just as a greater community of concerned adults and caring adults, is to understand that the fear of violence in many ways is greater than the actual demonstration of it in our schools. And that our policies have been constructed to respond to the worst possible scenario, which then criminalizes minor behaviors of children who are just learning how to be young adults, right? And they're going to make mistakes. Now, we have engaged in new rhetoric, new language now that talks about being trauma-informed. And everyone talks about trauma-informed practices, trauma-informed services. And really what I think is critical here is understanding that at the center of engaging in any trauma or healing-informed practice is asking the question that you just asked, which is, what is happening? What happened? Not what's wrong with you. What did you do? It's what happened. Talk to me about what is going on. And new research out of Stanford is showing that when educators do approach a disciplinary situation with that in mind, they call it empathic responses to problematic student behavior, that's when you start to see a reduction in suspensions. I think they found that the reduction in student suspensions for those classrooms and schools that engaged in empathic discipline, the reduction for Black and Latina girls was by 75%. Wow. I mean, it's outstanding. And really it's consistent with everything the girls are saying in this book, which is, I need someone to care for me. I need someone to ask me how I am doing. I need someone to see that I may talk back to you, but it's because I'm dealing with constant sexual harassment. I'm frustrated. I'm looking at these situations and I don't see myself anywhere represented in the course material. I feel irrelevant. There is an erasure of my experience. There's a way in which when I challenge you on my erasure that you consider me defiant and tell me to go home, and so there are lots of ways in which, we're all responsible for constructing this problematic condition. But I also feel like there's ways in which, because we're all responsible, we can all respond in ways to fix it, right? And so when we think about what needs to be in place, number one, the thing that I think community can do is to stop turning a blind eye to the sexual and physical victimization of Black girls. And the centrality of trauma related to the girls who are most at risk of contact with the juvenile legal system and school pushout is very great. Meaning, I'll put that in other ways, which is the girls who are most in trouble with the law and the girls who are most at risk of being pushed out of school are girls who have experienced some form of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. If we begin to, as a community, stop pretending that this doesn't exist in our communities, then we will begin to address the priming. I call it in the book, the priming of Black girls for their own victimization. We'll address those kinds of things, right? The ways in which our girls are singing songs from the moment they play patty cake that prepare them for a life of victimization and rape. Right? These are deeply problematic. And it's something that we don't have very rigorous conversations about that we need to. And so when we address that as a community, we present girls who are then ready to learn to schools, right? And we can also engage in conversations with educators about how they construct classroom climates that are inclusive of our girls, that are healing informed when they are responding to problematic student behavior, that have restorative and healing opportunities in schools, that engage our girls as leaders, that engage our girls as learners, as scholars, as participants in their full experience in school, and not relegating them to just being on the basketball team, right? Or just saying, okay, well, she's quiet, so she's fine. Sometimes silence doesn't equal being fine. Sometimes silence is also an expression of feeling and the erasure that we've been talking about this entire program. So there are ways in which, we can construct new classroom climates that are also about college and career readiness, that are responsive to the implicit biases that all of us hold, and all of us, are engaging when we make decisions about girls or when we see girls in our communities. But ultimately, there's got to be this way in which we unapologetically say that we are not going to throw away any of our kids. And we cannot engage in rhetoric or in practices that prioritize oppressions. That is not useful.
Yeah, the oppression Olympics, I think, is what you mentioned at the top of the show. That we as long as we're prioritizing them, then we're inevitably pushing someone to the back. And it seems that historically, black women, black girls have been pushed to the back in terms of addressing not only the systems of oppression, but the real trauma. And I think people are afraid of taking a moment to consider the oppression, not the oppression only, but the trauma also. I think the trauma more so because there's very real trauma points in each of these young girls' lives. And all I have to do is, reading your book really just reminded me of why that student was acting the way they were. And the fact that they did need someone to treat them with respect and to care for them and to love them without, as a male figure, letting it going over into another type of trauma, right?
Exactly.
And that type of relationship of having a black man or a man in general who can respect you as being a human being without taking advantage. I think people are afraid to, I think we're afraid to go over into that, because the more you consider it, the more it breaks your heart. Like it hurts me in the sense that I have to now consider my daughter growing up in this world of traumas that are now being prioritized, and seeing her trauma being pushed to the back. God forbid she has any, but this is a hard thing for our community, let alone the nation, to deal with. How do we as adults, how do we begin to cope with the trauma that we've allowed our daughters to experience without even fully addressing it?
Well, and the trauma that we're all living with in the form of historical trauma.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The trauma that we call racism, right?
Yeah.
The trauma that we call sexism. So, I think it's an interesting work in progress, that question, or the response to that question. And, I talk about the talk. And, when, these incidents were emerging out of Florida and Ohio and, Missouri, in New York, just sort of really demonstrating the absence of safety and the presence of state violence against Black men and boys in particular, there was this discussion about the talk that we needed to have with boys. And, from the outset, my daughters were also very much racialized and traumatized by the experiences that they saw play out and the public discussions that they saw play out on the violence against Black men and boys. And at that moment, it occurred to me that, in their eyes and in the girls' eyes that I interacted with, while writing this book and beyond, when we don't engage them in this conversation about safety, we are facilitating and in many ways exacerbating the violence in our communities. Because without having a candid conversation about how, sexism and patriarchy are part of the oppressions that cement the kind of vulnerabilities that our people are facing, then we're not really fully engaging in a conversation about how we can work together to do this work and this freedom work. I had the privilege of launching my discussions about Pushout with Angela Davis at an event in San Francisco. And so besides being over the moon giddy with doing anything with Angela Davis, she said something that really stuck with me and I think resonates in the sort of closing of this book. That was a quote from my mentor, Manning Marable, who wrote several books, including the scholarly biography of Malcolm X. And what she said was that this ultimately, like she said, we were never in the business of civil rights. This was not about the civil rights movement. We were in the freedom movement. We settled for civil rights, is what she said.
Oh, wow.
And so for me, I thought about this and it was constantly on my mind, even while writing Pushout, where, I really close my discussion about, what's possible by quoting my mentor and saying, freedom is first and foremost a public understanding among the members of a society to protect and defend any opinions that are unpopular or at odds with opinions held by those who actually exercise power and privilege. Freedom is the fragile flower that must constantly be protected, not from those at the bottom of the social order, but from the whims and desires of those at the top. Wow. And so for me, when I think about this work and I think about how we engage Black girls, we have to see them as integral to our freedom movement. They have been at the center of our civil rights discussions. Brown versus Board of Education was about a little Black girl wanting to go to school in her community, right? So, but we, Rosa Parks, everybody uplifts, Black women and girls in the civil rights space. But in our freedom work, we have to really do a much more intentional job of centering all of us who are impacted by structures of oppression and taking the time to really look at how we are each contributing to and undermining these opportunities for there to be whole development and healing from the historical trauma that impacts all of us, as well as the unique policies and practices that facilitate criminalization today.
We've been speaking with Dr. Monique Morris. She is the author of the book Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. Monique, do you have time for about 2 more questions?
Sure, I do.
Okay, because I probably honestly have at least 10 more, but I'm going to limit it to 2 to respect your time. The first one is the question of race. How have you found, or what is your thesis on why we're more willing to explore the question of why someone is reacting this way, at least in our school systems, for young white girls, and then across town, or even got in the same school, we are not willing to explore that with young Black girls. Why is that, and how do we overcome that?
Well, I think girls in general are often sort of presented as a monolithic group. And historically, I remember writing something in 2002 and searching for data on Black girls aged 12 to 17, and I could find very few pieces of scholarship that centered Black girls. And while there was a growing, body of work exploring Black womanhood, Black girlhood was distinctly absent from our, real construction of identity and understanding. And so, for me, I was like, what is that? And how does that play out then in how we see Black girls, and if we see Black girls at all? And so, I talk a bit about W.E.B. Du Bois's articulation of double consciousness and how that two-ness for Black girls and women is actually a threeness at the minimum, and that third identity around gender and that component around gender cannot be erased when we're talking about the experiences of life among this population. At no point, do they stop being one or the other or any of the all, right? And so, that impacts how we move forward. For girls in schools, most of it has been constructed around the identity of white girls. So girlhood is even constructed with the idea that our conversations about girlhood have been normed to the experiences of white middle class girls. So poor white girls are often erased, and anyone who is not a middle class white person, who is female and identifies as such, is typically sort of left out of our public imagination when we talk about girlhood. And so that has been problematic because even, when you look at the kinds of books that are offered, the narratives that are shared, the ways in which we construct learning, how that is, brought into spaces like schools, really does negatively impact Black girls who don't see themselves there at all. It's interesting because last week was the United States of Women Summit in Washington, D.C., which was a White House convened summit of 5,000 women and girls to talk about the conditions of women and girls in the U.S. And I thought it was beautiful that there were so many Black girls who were a part of that discussion about women and girls. And I'm sure that's not by accident when you have a Black First Lady and a Black president, that we see such an intentional centering of Black girlhood in a conversation about girlhood. But in the context of this was Marley Diaz, who is the founder of 1,000 Black Girl Books. She, is a very young, super intelligent, high-performing girl who recognized that there was an absence of books that centered Black girls in them. That she said, I was tired of reading a whole bunch of books about white boys and their dogs, right? And that in school, that's all I was getting. And so what she did with her, powerhouse mom was put together a strategy to correct that. And so what you see is this tendency for Black girls to try to engage in behaviors that either correct what they see as problematic or function in a way that still operates in defiance of the structures of oppression. And so when they operate in ways that are dismissive, like one of the cases in the book where a girl didn't want to read a book about slavery because she felt like it was, insulting to her. Part of it is because of how the instruction was taking place. She was a girl who was in detention, reading a book about slavery, and she felt like it was reinforcing her subservience. Wow. And so one could read that and see, okay, she was triggered by this book because she was in an institution very much like that of slavery, right? And so she didn't want to read a book about a happy slave. She wanted to read a book about something else. And her act of defiance was read certainly as that. It was read as an affront to the authority of the educator, and she was placed outside of the class, which was more harmful to her than sitting there. I don't know. Actually, that's arguable. Maybe one could say that she was better served by not having to internalize the material that would try to reinforce her subservience. But these are the questions that we're dealing with, right? These are the things that we're dealing with in real time that have not really been interrogated because there hasn't really been the centering of the experiences of Black girls. So I'm hopeful that with Pushout and other emerging research that's coming, that we are able to have a much more robust conversation about the experiences of Black girls, how they might be different from other girls. Many of the girls in this book are Black Latina, who are often not discussed either in conversations about Latinas or conversations about Black girls. So it was really important for me to include them. Same with trans girls, who are often left out of conversations about feminine identity and the experiences of girls in schools. So, the inclusion of these narratives was really important as we start this conversation. I don't think we're anywhere near the conclusion of it.
Wow. You actually touched on the next question. I wanted to ask you about the class component to this, right? Did you, in your research, and not just for this book, but your research since writing this book, have you found any type of disparity or different treatment of Black girls based on economic strata? What have you found along those lines?
Well, what's interesting is that, much of the implementation of instruments of surveillance, the metal detectors, security cameras, law enforcement, et cetera, in schools, those happen disproportionately in communities that are high high poverty schools, low performing high poverty schools. It's interesting to think about it also in terms of how it's played out in our public domain versus how it's played out in our private schools, right? And other independent schools that don't tend to have the same degree of punishment or punitive surveillance. The low income communities are often dealing with other structures, again, and with schools within these systems. They're often reinforcing the negative status quo conditions that impact life outside of the school. So the same surveillance that's happening in schools is the surveillance that happens on their way to school, on their way back from school. I remember being in a school in New York with a colleague, and we asked the girls how many of them are concerned about their safety getting to school, and almost all the hands went up, right? And so, there's a real sense of urgency around safety that has yet to be engaged in these low-performing, high-poverty schools. Since researching Pushout and really looking at sort of what's happening among other groups, though, I think the issue about how Black feminine identity is misconstrued and responded to differently in schools is also one, though, that is not only present in the public, low-performing, high-poverty schools, that we also see high-performing girls who come from middle-class communities or above, who are also experiencing differential treatment. And that is why I think it's important for us to center these discussions about implicit bias and the way in which we're making decisions that may, we're all living in this racially stratified society. We recognize race, we talk about race a lot, but we don't talk about it well publicly, and arguably privately either. But to the extent that it intersects with other identities to impact how people are receiving and interacting with structures and institutions and agencies, there's a particular void. And so when we're talking about girls and their experiences in schools, regardless of their socioeconomic status, teachers are seeing girls as Black girls as Black girls, and they're engaging with them as Black girls. And so anecdotally, I've received calls, complaints. I've, certainly interacted with individuals who described for me the ways in which their Black girl in private schools in very affluent communities are treated differently because they're perceived as loud, they're perceived as disruptive, they're perceived as aggressive. And so, these, again, are code words that I think are worthy of our deep interrogation and deconstruction as we start to really look at what our girls need to be thriving in this society, and to work very diligently toward the goal of creating that reality with them.
In your book, you say Black femininity must not be exploited, ignored, and punished. Dr. Monique W. Morris, I have read the book, and I'm ashamed to say that I haven't handed it to my wife to read. But as soon as I get home tonight, I'm passing this over to my wife to read, because we want to learn from this and construct a world for, it's as progressive and intersectional as I think I may be. I have carefully crafted a world to raise my son in the most positive and trauma-free environment as possible, and it was second nature to me. I didn't even have to think about it. I knew what I needed to do, and I have every day since my daughter was born, I have been thinking, how do I don't know how to do the same thing for my daughter. And I've looked and leaned to my wife on how do we create a trauma-free world. That may not have been the language that I used, but that was the intent, to make sure that we were able to raise her in an environment that's best for her to blossom and to be a carefree, intelligent young woman who is as free in this country as I'm fighting for my son to be. I knew how to do it for my son. I didn't know how to do it for my daughter. And I want to thank you for this book, because it helps me to understand the problem a lot more. So I'm definitely going to pass this over to my wife. And I want to encourage my listeners to pick up the book, Pushout: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. Dr. Morris, thank you so much. I want you to get the last word and just tell everyone how they can get up with you and where they can reach you. I found you on Twitter. We need to get you at least 25,000 followers on Twitter. We need to do that. But just give some closing comments and tell us how to give it up with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you acknowledging and being vulnerable in this space because that's often what it takes for us to really move past the silence.
Hmm.
I have had many interactions across the country in different cities, and each of them I take with me as a gift. And one of the more powerful questions that I often receive from men is, that how do I get engaged? I think women are often clearer about how they get engaged because they were once girls.
Hmm.
But for men, sometimes it is difficult for them, and they say, well, I don't know, I can't really speak on the girls, I can't really speak on the women.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I have been encouraging men to do is really to do just the opposite, to speak on the girls, speak on the women, right? Speak with boys about the women, not in a
Hmm.
way that reinforces negative stereotypes, but that really engages in the exploration of the oppressions that we've been talking about on this show. So I deeply appreciate you being a case study in that space and really
I'm
bringing
willing.
yourself forward in that space. I appreciate that. I can certainly be found on Twitter at Monique W. Morris. My organization, the National Black Women's Justice Institute, is engaged in several projects that are working to interrupt school to confinement pathways, alone and in partnership with the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality, and several other partners in this work. So I can be found at nbwji.org or moniquewmorris.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you for joining us. I will be reaching out to get you back on just to further this conversation with my audience and so many more. I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. And we'll be
Of
speaking with
course.
you soon.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
I want to say to my audience, because I know my audience is not all black, obviously. I know I have a lot of white people in my audience. I have a lot of white men in my audience. And last night I was talking about the things that we need to do. Actually, I'm sorry. I recorded it last night and you're probably seeing it now. So I'm speaking about the things that we need to do to make this progressive movement truly intersectional. And I can't tell you, I cannot stress to you how real the trauma is for young black girls. I know firsthand what the trauma is like for young black men. And I was joking with my wife. It wasn't funny, but we were joking about it. Growing up in Mississippi in the 80s was not too far from growing up in Mississippi in the 70s and some of the 60s, right? Some of the trauma that you get in the surrounding structures and the authority and the expectation of you being a certain type of way and you getting treated that way because of their preconceived notions of who you are, and that following you all the way through school, all the way into college, and getting stopped by police officers like 10 times in a semester just because you were a black guy. And the reason I know is just because I was a black guy driving a truck is because I never got a ticket on any occasion. And so I understand it from a very real perspective what it is to be a black man. And I went off on that tangent just to bring it all the way back in to say that if we're going to be truly intersectional, we have to become comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations, right? We have to be willing to hear and not just do it for political expediency, not to do it in the sense of, I want to be the expert. I want to be the male expert on black girl trauma. No, I have no desire to be the male expert on black girl trauma, right? I have all the desire to elevate the voices of people who are the experts on it. I have more than a desire to help Dr. Morris push her book and to have every person read it possible. So it's not that we want to learn this intersectionality so that we can now be on Twitter and be the spokesperson. No, it's so that we can create these safer spaces. And I'm not saying safe space in the sense of the Stanford University issue or was it Yale? I'm saying the ability for young people, black, white, Hispanic, Latina, whatever, black, every race, every ethnicity, to have the opportunity to grow up without these traumas being ever present. I know about black young men trauma, black boy trauma. I am very cognizant of black girl trauma. and mainly because I'm a father, right? I have a beautiful little girl, and I'm very conscious of the world that we're exposing her to. And I think that's really all it takes, is for us to be willing. And do I have white men? Let's go to church, right? Let's go to church. Do I have white progressive men in my audience who are willing to listen to the trauma, unpack, and have someone teach you about the trauma without you going on Twitter and becoming the overnight expert on that trauma? And instead of becoming your resident Twitter expert and doing what, a lot of things we complain about from these intersectional conversations where you have white people lecturing white people about the black experience, instead of being that Twitter expert and social media expert or that spokesperson about black girl trauma, just give a comfortable space for them to discuss it themselves and for us to listen. Because if we can do that, then we can create a progressive movement that is truly intersectional and not a liberal movement that co-opts the language of intersectionality for political expediency. This is what's necessary. So I'm challenging the white men in my audience, along with black men and along with white women, just everybody. I'm challenging my entire audience to absorb that conversation and find some way for you to identify with it from a personal perspective, right? When you put yourself as empathy, she was talking about empathy the entire time. When you place yourself in the shoes of someone else and you try to see the world through their lenses, then that opens you up to a wealth of emotions that would allow you to have compassion for a group of people that you otherwise may not have even paid attention to. And if for no other reason than to create a space for people to grow up without these traumas and traumas that we don't even talk about. But then also for the reason of creating a truly intersectional progressive movement so that we're no longer on our heels being chased by fake intersectionality, but we can present a true intersectionality where black women, black Latinas, black girls, white women, white men, white working class men, every demographic, every experience can come to the table and see our commonalities and see that there are things that we need to overcome for the best interest of every intersection. That's all I've got for you, folks. That's all I've got for you tonight. It was a little heavy conversation, but I hope you gleaned as much as you possibly could. I will see you next time.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog, join the Progressive Army, and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. It's Ben Dixon! If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.
Consider becoming a Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show.